So, you may have heard I wrote a book. Last year when I was writing this book, I basically lived inside it. I would occasionally come out for food and water, carry out a few more other responsibilities in life. And I thought, okay, in 2018, I'm going to relax a little bit. So my plan for resting in 2018 has not so far worked out. I spent a lot of the past 8 months giving talks, meeting with people, writing more commentaries, reflecting on the various responses to the book. Judging both from what people write to me, what people ask me at talks, I've been very impressed and heartened that there is so much desire to reduce both poverty and inequality in Singapore. I wrote the book because I had a vague hunch that these things are true, but the reach of this book and the significant responses it has provoked has exceeded my expectations. Our lives in Singapore are often very individualized. We hold this stereotype of ourselves as apathetic and disengaged, and this can feel very lonely. And I think that loneliness, that lack of sense of solidarity with others, can be very disempowering. So I start with mentioning these responses I've received about my book to highlight that a lot of Singaporeans do in fact care. Of course, it's not everyone, nor a majority, but I think it's nonetheless significant and meaningful. I think it's important to recognize this as a moment of possibility. It may be fleeting, and it is potential that's not yet translated into reality. I do not take for granted that this moment will lead to real reduction in poverty, real changes to how our opportunity structures work, real improvements in redistributing our country's ample resources. I think what happens to this potential depends on what we do in the next 5, 10, 20 years. But now let me turn more directly to the subject of today's talk, growing up in an unequal society. So my book is based on 3 years of ethnographic research to study the everyday lives of people in Singapore who live with very low income. I focus my work mostly on families with children who live in HDB rental flats. One principle that underlies ethnographic research: you approach in an open-ended way, you spend time in a place, you have many informal conversations without very rigid survey or interview questions. And through this approach, an ethnographer can learn things they did not know to ask about. I ended up finding out a lot about family lives, that family life in households where there are young people revolves around and centers on children's needs. The difficulties with education, the difficulties parents face in raising youth, these were topics that found me. In my conversations with parents, education came up repeatedly as a major source of anxiety. Low-income parents, and especially mothers, told me that one important reason why they quit their jobs or cut back on wage work is because their kids are struggling in school. They talk to me about children failing weekly spelling tests or teachers calling them up regularly to speak to them about their kids' problems with schoolwork. Many of the kids from low-income families fall behind almost immediately as soon as they enter the first year of compulsory schooling. They are less advanced than kids from wealthier families, who often can read and write by the day they enter primary 1. Very quickly, many of these kids barely pass or completely fail English and mathematics. They usually still do reasonably well in mother tongue, which many use at home, and this signals that the kids generally do have the capacity to learn when there is sufficient exposure to a subject. In primary 1 and 2, many of the kids from the low-income families are identified as having problems. They're pulled out of class for extra coaching. Although this can help, it is not easy for the kids to catch up, since the more advanced kids continue to move forward at a fast pace. By primary 3, many kids from low-income families are tracked, are banded into lower performing classes. Although schools vary in how obvious the banding is at primary 3 and 4, the kids themselves are well aware of where they stand vis-a-vis others. By primary 5 and 6, many of the kids do so poorly that they switch to what is known as foundation level for some or all of their subjects. While most parents I spoke with reported their kids are still going to school regularly, it's also obvious that many develop a sense of themselves as inferior to others and start to feel quite demoralized. In some cases, kids begin to resist going to school. If conditions are unstable at home, parents also find it difficult to manage their children's school schedules. If they do indeed stop going to school regularly, their social connections at school will suffer, When they return, the absence of friends, the lack of friends, teasing, bullying from schoolmates, these things can make staying the course difficult. How should we interpret all this? Both children and their parents face many difficulties due to complex home situations, but the schooling experience itself is crucial for understanding their relative lack of educational success. This becomes especially clear when I speak with parents who are trying to get their kids to go to school every day. The Singapore education system is one that demands precocity. This means that it demands children to be able to display their skills at early ages. And displaying certain qualities in reading and in mathematics in particular brings rewards. How does the demand for precocity play out in generating and perpetuating inequalities? People who work with kids will know that students are sensitive about how they compare to their peers. One teacher I spoke with told me that students who are in lower bands will say things like, "I stupid lah, I lazy what." They don't try because they do not believe they can possibly succeed. Teachers working with kids in low tracks have to spend time and energy on behavioral issues that are linked to low self-esteem and lack of motivation. They are more disruptive in classrooms and more likely to skip school or neglect homework. This phenomenon is not something limited to Singapore, nor unknown to pedagogical researchers. Jeannie Oakes, in a classic study on tracking, another word for streaming, shows that one of the detrimental effects of tracking students, according to narrow criteria of academic abilities, is that students in low tracks often think of themselves as poor learners, and that thinking of themselves as poor learners also leads to them not trying as hard as students in high tracks who tend to think of themselves as capable. In other words, quote-unquote, low motivation is something that is reproduced within the school context. There are some positive things to multiple tracks. Kids are not completely thrown out. There are still tracks open to them. However, there appears to me to be an irrational outcome. Most of these kids appear to be of regular intelligence and regular learning abilities, but they are labeled slow from a young age. In speaking to an allied educator whose job it is to work with kids with learning disabilities, I learned that it takes some time for her to figure out which kids have disabilities. Because most of the kids who come to her attention are behind simply because they have not had as much exposure to school materials, and not because they are unable to learn in neurotypical ways. Given time and exposure, they are no less capable of learning than most other children. They lack exposure for a variety of reasons. They have less preschool education, their parents do not speak English or the type of English required in schools, there is limited reading at home, and they do not have extra coaching by tuition teachers. In other words, the main reason they fall behind can be traced to their relative class disadvantages. If we turn our view around, we see that given the ubiquity of enrichment centers and tutors in Singapore, some kids, because of class advantages, are advantaged in a system where early exposure and precocity are rewarded. So the kids who are able to run forward the moment the gates are open are neither more meritorious nor more deserving. Why do I call this an irrational outcome? If we think of schools as places of learning, if equality of opportunity is upheld as our education system's mantra, and if the purpose of mass education is to train as many capable individuals as we can, who will grow up to be contributing members of our society, then kids who have insufficient exposure outside of school should have sufficient exposure within it and sufficient time to even out the advantages or disadvantages resulting from class differences. Kids should not be punished for having insufficient exposure outside of it. In rewarding precocity, expecting kids to be able to read and write when they begin primary 1, for example, we are rewarding qualities that are acquired outside of school, and in the process, we are losing valuable potential of talents and strengths in kids who need time and exposure. The effects of early sorting and early labeling are also profound for parents. Parents with more money also tend to be parents who have the confidence to say, my child is not stupid, he or she just needs more help. How our kids are branded by our schools the information parents get from schools about how they compare to other children, these things shape parents' ideas about our own children and what they are capable of. If I believe my child is fundamentally, even with poor grades, capable, then my solution is to find help, especially if I have money to pay for this help. If in contrast, over time, I am told repeatedly by teachers that my child is very weak, my child is very unmotivated, then as a parent, my sense of my kid is that he or she is like me, not so good in school, not likely to do well. If I don't have money for tutors anyway, then my aspirations for my child too will be adjusted accordingly. Parents' opinions and actions feed into a child's sense of themselves and their potential. Many of the parents I meet have high hopes that their children will do better than them, that their children won't end up with the hard lives they've had. But they parent in a context where their children are already branded as weaker, as lesser, as not as smart, as not as capable. And it is incredibly difficult to transcend that and to see their kids as still having talents and value. I see many low-income parents trying to do this. But like many of us who try our best to form independent opinions, we are not immune to the voices of others. We parent in specific social contexts, and those contexts shape our hopes and our actions. We depend strongly on teachers' assessments and understandings of our children, and we evaluate our children according to what seems normal in our society. In many of the stories that families tell themselves about themselves, their children are good at soccer, or dancing, or cooking, or helping with housework and care, but hopeless at mathematics and English. And once these stories solidify into common sense, both parents and children have a hard time coming out from under these labels. The home environment of low-income kids is indeed not always conducive to studying. Spaces are small, family relationships are sometimes tense, material hardships are persistent. But this could be said for many Singaporean adults who now find themselves middle class in contemporary Singapore. Many of my peers grew up in exactly these not conducive environments. And this perhaps explains higher income Singaporeans' reluctance to interrogate systematic inequality and an attendant rush to judge the low income. If I could overcome hardship, why can't they? Some people ask. To understand the persistence of low educational achievement and what appears to be the reproduction of class inequalities among the low income today, we must look beyond individual families' practices. We have to examine the broader social context and important developments in the education system's criteria, its dynamics, its principles. And very importantly, although counterintuitive, we have to look at wider social practices of parents across class lines. In the 1980s, when I was in primary school, I didn't have tuition. None of my friends did. My parents spent approximately 0 hours a week helping me with my homework. And this is roughly the same amount of time my classmates' parents spent on theirs. It is very important when those who are now wealthier than they were growing up declare that they were able to overcome. It's very important to remember that we are not living in 1970s, 1980s Singapore anymore. So what is today's context? Across class lines, meaning for people in various class backgrounds, I am struck by the amount of time and energy parents today, regardless of income and profession, put into keeping an eye on their children's progress in school. The difficulty of the curriculum, the understanding that exams have high-stake consequences for their kids' future, and the difficulty of teaching one's own children have fueled the growth of the tuition industry. Parents with ample means use these to help their children from the get-go, in some cases as young as preschool, and on a regular basis, meaning throughout the school years. Parents with more moderate means forego other household needs and hire tutors during crucial exam years or on subjects especially tough for their kids. Tuition has become a billion-dollar industry, with parents spending significant proportions of household income on it. Apart from tuition for academic subjects, an entire industry also exists for enrichment programs. Some of these are meant to further hone skills that contribute to academic performance in schools. And others are essentially insurance policies, ways for kids to develop other types of talents that can also open doors to so-called good schools or higher tracks in case their academic results fall short. The fact that these exist also tell us this. Some parents are diligently learning about how the system works and are active campaigners on behalf of their children. I do not fault parents for wanting the best for their children, but we must acknowledge that this type of campaigning is not class neutral. It comes more easily to people who have themselves succeeded in the system, who understand its logic. It comes more easily to people who feel a sense of entitlement in their interactions with teachers. It comes more easily to people who have time to devote to this labor and who have budgets that allow for various aspects of this, including buying books, hiring tutors, cutting back on full-time employment. Worries about inequalities in the education system often center on the low-performing and often focus on quote-unquote leveling up. Kids from low-income families are often the target group. The presence of numerous programs, personnel, and public expenditure intended to level up these kids, combined with the persistence of low performance among these kids, often leads to the perception that kids from low-income families are less motivated or lack the right home environment for studying. More generally, many Singaporeans take for granted that the system is merit-based and there are ample opportunities for everyone, regardless of their family backgrounds. These perspectives are not wrong per se, but I think they are insufficiently precise. And in their imprecision, they slip into faulting low-income parents for the poor academic performance of their kids. To understand why kids from low-income households do poorly in schools, we would do well to understand what their lives at home are like. But we must also step back and situate their lives within the broader social context. And this involves trying to understand what material conditions are like for their parents, what school experiences are like for the kids, and finally, and least often done, what higher income families are doing for their kids, or for our kids. It is when we do all this that we can have a more complete and accurate understanding of how kids from low-income families within this system are compelled to play a game they cannot win because someone else is setting the rules. There is a lot and increasing attention on the educational opportunities of kids from lower-income families. This is important, but if attention is only focused on this, in 10 years, I worry that we will find ourselves standing more or less in the same spot. I think we must frame the challenge differently, not as one where the problem is with the kids from low-income families, but one where the problem is about our system of rewards, as well as what parents from higher income families are doing in response to this system of rewards. I know this is a very uncomfortable way of approaching the problem because it requires those of us who tend to be the ones talking about the problem to admit to our own complicity. But I think it's crucial if we are serious about this problem. We cannot keep doing the same things and expect outcomes to be different. Let me turn now to another set of findings, that of parenting youth. The essay from which this is drawn is titled Growing Up Without Class Protections. Let me begin by saying that it took me some time to see the form of this essay. And this is because it took me a while to fully recognize that maintaining family relationships and maintaining parental authority, especially over teenage children, is something that requires economic and social resources. We often refer to family life as priceless, something we cannot put a price on. We imply that this is an area of life that cannot be bought, that somehow transcends money. I would like to highlight that while it is true that family life cannot be bought per se, that certain material preconditions are nonetheless very important. And these preconditions do require money and what money is able to purchase. Parenting is hard, and it's hard at multiple stages of life. It is hard in good circumstances, but harder yet when one has limited time, money, and social spending. When I speak to parents with teenage kids, these are the worries I hear of. Kids who spend long hours away from home, hanging out with friends, kids who are unsure of their future vocations and who are struggling in school or dropping out, kids who are at risk of unplanned pregnancies, kids who have material needs that are not easily fulfilled, kids getting into trouble with the police for things like underage smoking, drugs, and theft. And we often talk about at-risk youth or juvenile delinquents as if they automatically arise from bad neighborhoods or dysfunctional families. And the unspoken presumption is that youth go astray because parents are neglectful. In the neighborhoods where I did my research, it was actually often parents themselves who were expressing worries about their kids. I saw parents stressed out at their relationships with their teenage children, worried about the fact that their children were not listening to them, not coming home, not heeding their advice to take their parents' lives as cautionary tales. Clearly, the full story goes beyond, well beyond, parental neglect. After hearing parents express their worries and anxieties about kids, and after observing youths who hang out in low-income neighborhoods, and from talking to social workers who work with young people, it strikes me that we don't adequately acknowledge the complex care needs and care gaps of youth. For our constant talk about family as the central unit of Singapore society, we pay very little attention to the everyday contours of family life. And when we begin to think about what youths need, we start to realize that kids in low-income households do not have some of the protections that kids in higher-income households have. When it comes to raising older children, all parents struggle with maintaining some sphere of influence and authority. These are difficult because older kids are not like younger kids. They are able to go out on their own every day. They are able to live their lives more independently than young children. You can't keep them at home. They are more aware of the world beyond their families. These are exactly the reasons low-income parents struggle more than their higher-income counterparts. In the essay in the book, I describe the relevance of things we don't often talk about and which turn out to be very important for parenting youth. First, space, activities, and pocket money. Second, time, the possibility of leisure and the building of memories. And third, the social standing of parents shapes how parents can parent and the authority they have over their children. The reality of living in a low-income household is that there is very little space for privacy. Even parents do not usually have a bedroom to themselves, so children certainly do not have much private space. When I visited homes, I saw people creatively use bed sheets and furniture to create partitions for some semblance of privacy for teenage children, especially for girls. Still, the limitations of small flats means that teenagers often find it more pleasant to spend time outside the home with friends than to be at home. In cases where relationships are fraught, as they often are between parents and teenage children, regardless of class, the tendency to stay away naturally intensifies. When parents speak about wishing they could have bigger flats, one of the reasons they mention is that they would like their kids to have their own private space and perhaps even be able to bring friends home to do homework, study, socialize, without being disturbed by younger siblings or other family members. Unlike kids whose parents have money for enrichment or for leisure activities, kids from low-income families have more hours in the day when they are unoccupied and away from adults, compared to kids who are more financially dependent on their parents and therefore perhaps compelled to be more pliant. Teenagers from low-income households more often earn their own pocket money through part-time work. So in certain ways, they are more mature, more independent, and more autonomous than their middle-class counterparts. They also tend to have peers who are similarly independent and therefore available to hang out with. As a result of this confluence of factors, parents are more likely to have limited influence over their kids. Kids sometimes stop going to school, stay out late, or stay away from home altogether. To put this plainly, middle-class parents hold authority over their teenage children partly through circumstance. The kids' financial dependence on parents, the use of personal spaces in their homes, their scheduled activities, all of these are conditions that grant middle-class parents continued access to influence over their everyday lives. And absent of these conditions, authority is tough to maintain for low-income parents. Parenting is a socially embedded activity, and by this I mean two things. First, it is linked to other elements of everyday life: employment, leisure, schooling. Second, it is shaped by and rooted in the broader expectations, demands, and habits of society. No one, in other words, is just a parent, and no one parents in isolation. While we are parents, we are also simultaneously employees, co-workers, spouses, siblings, daughters, sons, neighbors, friends. We figure out how to be parents, partly from how teachers relate to us, what extended family members ask of us, what professionals, doctors, counselors, social workers tell us. Many of us like to imagine we are independent, cross class lines, yeah? People often declare, I just want to do what I want to do, I don't care what other people say. But the reality is that what makes for a good or bad parent is shaped very much by circumstances and informed by criteria beyond any given individual's control. Parenting under poor conditions involves high pressures from lack of money and lack of control over time. And these lead to care gaps, not only for very young children, but also for older ones. And they make building family lives, including happy memories of play and leisure, and everyday life activities of communication and relationship building, they make all these things very difficult. I've been saying for a number of years now that the poverty story is the story people don't mind hearing, but the inequality lens is the one we actually need in order to better see what is going on. We have tended to look at the challenges faced by kids from low-income households as if they are separate from the lives of kids from higher-income households. If we are serious about improving the lives of people, such that everyone living in this society can meet their needs, we must look at the ways in which unequal conditions lead to unequal outcomes. The conditions must be where we place our attention to effect change, not the persons who are now in low-income circumstances. I spend a lot of time in my book discussing the practices and norms among higher-income persons. And I spend a lot of time in the book discussing how access to various needs, housing and care support, for example, are deeply dependent on wage income, and how wage inequalities map onto people's access to certain public goods. When I hear responses to my book over the past 8 months, I know that it continues to be very hard to look inequality in the eye. It is more bearable to sidestep the question of inequality, which is essentially about the uneven and unfair distribution of resources, and go straight to the issue of what can be done to, quote-unquote, help the poor. In the past few months, I've met many people and groups who are doing really good work, who are very committed to helping the low income, who would like me to say to them that investing in early childhood education is the solution. We go around in circles in our conversations, them wanting to hear what I cannot say because I do not believe it to be true on its own. I, of course, do not have a monopoly over truth. I can only say what I know from the data I have. From my research, I see that the barriers that kids from low-income families face have to do with the broader reward systems we all live in, and the ways in which our system rewards some qualities and not others. These qualities can and are bought by money. The barriers kids face also have to do with their limited access to family lives, and that in turn has to do with the poor job conditions and low wages their parents face. Focusing on inequality is uncomfortable, because if the problem is the unequal distribution of things, then the solution has to be more equal distribution of things. And this requires a great deal of undoing of our common sense about what it is our system rewards and values, what our society takes for granted about people's worth and people's dignity and people's deservedness. Returning to the issue of children, these are 3 things I think need to change in our approach. First, our education system has to stop insisting on precocity. Instead, it has to give children more time to learn and develop their varied strengths at a reasonable pace. I think this would benefit everyone, students, teachers, parents, across class lines. We have a great education infrastructure, well-trained teachers, ample resource materials, buildings. It is possible, I think, for these to be more widely enjoyed. Time must be the gift we grant kids to learn and teachers to teach. Second, the well-being of kids and their parents are deeply intertwined. The wages of adults, their work conditions, the access that adults have to healthcare, to childcare support, to housing, these shape the everyday lives and well-beings of families. Children make for good targets for interventions because people's positive prejudices regarding their innocence allow us very easily to harness support when we focus on children. But children live in families. We cannot separate thinking about the well-being of children from those of their caregivers. So adults' needs for better wages, for better work conditions, where they have better control over their schedules, access to public goods that do not replicate market inequalities. These are crucial rather than secondary. Third, when thinking about interventions and helping, we must think in terms of creating conditions that allow people mastery over their own lives, that allow people to make the best decisions for their families, and interventions that are aimed at forcing people into a certain mold, rather than giving people room to exercise agency and mastery, will not meet their needs. I want to close by returning to this. So I see a lot of people trying to have conversations, and I'm very appreciative of this. But I also know that having these conversations is difficult. Yeah, it's challenging. And I encounter the difficulty we have talking to one another, trying to comprehend each other using different mental frameworks, using different vocabularies. So within this moment of possibility, the challenge around having conversations is twofold. We have to keep trying to understand the issues better, but we are also having to keep struggling to make space to talk about these issues in a civil way that allows for disagreement and allows for understanding. Over the past few months, I also sense impatience. I recently realized that because this book is fairly easy to read, that both readers and myself as a writer can forget that a lot of academic work went into it. I spent many years thinking about some of the key puzzles, trying to answer them in different ways before I wrote this book. I'm saying this because I think it's not obvious, that research takes time, it's sometimes meandering, and that the purposes of resolving puzzles, research puzzles, are not always solutions-oriented in the same ways that organizations are. And I want to say this explicitly because I think we live in a world somewhat impatient for solutions. Our attentions are scattered, rarely sustained. We don't like to read long things. We want things to be summarized. I am also a member of this impatient world, so I too am sometimes impatient for solutions. Because of this book, I've been asked a lot about how we can come up with solutions. And I feel a certain urgency to respond to this call. But as a scholar, a major responsibility I have is to scrutinize, analyze, contemplate. I'm always trying to turn things on their head, to get people to look at things using different lenses. This is pretty much my only value to society, is doing that. With this work on poverty and inequality, I can see that as a society, we have very deep prejudices, very deep instincts, and these are not easily overturned. I can see people responding positively to my book in one moment, and in the next moment, going back to habits, to old frameworks, to common sense ways of thinking that are exactly the problems I'm trying to point to. So my role as I see it is often to say, hey, let's slow down and ask, what are we assuming about how individuals function here, about how power works, about how changes come about? Can we think about the problem differently before we construct solutions? If we don't take the time to go deeply into explanations that are nuanced and sometimes contradictory, if we don't do the hard work of examining and be willing to scrutinize our policies at the level of principles rather than at the level of delivery, if we don't do this work, our solutions will not solve. And if we keep doing essentially the same things, we should not be surprised when things turn out essentially the same. This does not mean we just sit on our hands and not talk about solutions. I am very interested in having conversations with people in different fields and different sectors with different experience and knowledge so that we can talk precisely about how we as a society can do better than we have. I would also highlight the importance of continually moving back and forth to talk about short-term goals and long-term hopes, back and forth between scales, what is possible for individuals and small groups of people to do, and what it is that has to be done on a societal scale. Sometimes what we do in the short term may harm what we want to achieve in the long term. What we do on a small scale may short-circuit what we want done on a large scale. Finally, in this moment of possibility, I see a certain kind of pessimism and cynicism. And I've encountered it repeatedly over the past months. People keep telling me, systems are too hard to change. Let's focus on what community can do. Let's focus on what we as individuals can do, how charities and groups can step up. Let's not look to the government. On this, I find myself in a rather odd position, given my critiques of the state, of insisting that we do not become cynical about our public systems. Policies, regulations, laws, they shape our lives deeply and profoundly. Most of the conditions in which we as individuals make our decisions and live our lives are shaped through public policy. Without attention to these, no matter how much money we pour into other kinds of solutions, we will not be able to shift things in meaningful ways. When we look at the international research on inequality, the evidence is very clear. We know that public policy is absolutely crucial for mitigating it. So don't be cynical or pessimistic about systemic changes. It is possible. I do think this is a moment of possibility, but in it there are constraints and challenges. And for it to be more than a moment of possibility, I think there's a great deal of work to do. And I hope many of us will have the resolve, the commitment, and the energy to work together in the years ahead.